I never believed in any of this stuff before it happened to me. Bigfoot, cryptids, monsters in the woods. All of it seemed like nonsense for people who watch too much TV. I'm an investment analyst. I deal in facts and figures, risk assessments, and data. The closest I'd ever come to outdoor adventure was playing golf at country clubs. But I've got a photograph that changed everything I thought I knew about what's really out there in the wilderness. What I'm about to tell you happened exactly as I'm describing it, and that single image is proof that some stories are too insane to be made up. Before you write me off as some conspiracy nut, let me give you some background. I work in finance in Chicago, made decent money analyzing market trends and managing portfolios for high net worth clients. I surrounded myself with the kind of people who think money can buy you anything, including access to places you probably shouldn't go. That's how I ended up on this godforsaken trip that changed everything. It was December 2019 when my business partner suggested we needed a real adventure for our annual guys' trip. The usual Vegas routine was getting old, he said, and we needed something with more substance. He had connections everywhere. His uncle knew a guy who knew a guy. And somehow he'd arranged for us to get special access to a remote forest reservation in northern Montana. The kind of place civilians don't normally get to camp in, but money talks, and he had plenty of it. There were 5 of us total, all city guys who thought we were tougher than we actually were because we'd been camping a few times at state parks with proper facilities. Investment types, finance bros, the kind of people who measure everything in terms of exclusivity and cost. The arrangement was that we'd have a forest ranger as our guide and safety supervisor. Looking back now, I realize how much we probably annoyed the hell out of the guy before things went sideways. His name was Daryl, and he'd been working that reservation for over 15 years. Mid-40s, weathered face, the kind of guy who looked like he had seen everything the wilderness could throw at him. When we first met Daryl at the ranger station, you could tell he wasn't thrilled about babysitting a bunch of city boys. He was professional about it, but there was this look in his eyes like he'd rather be doing literally anything else. His supervisor had apparently twisted his arm into taking this assignment, probably because we'd paid premium rates for the exclusive wilderness experience. Daryl briefed us on the basics: weather patterns, wildlife to watch out for, emergency procedures. He mentioned bears, mountain lions, wolves, the usual suspects you'd expect in that part of Montana, but he never said anything about the other stories. The ones I found out later he'd been hearing for years but never believed. The first 2 days were exactly what you'd expect from a group of overpaid city guys pretending to be outdoorsmen. We set up our expensive gear, took photos for social media, complained about the cold, and generally acted like the tourists we were. Daryl kept us safe, monitored the weather reports, made sure we didn't do anything too stupid. He was good at his job, even if he clearly thought we were idiots. 2 of the guys spent most of their time trying to one-up each other with survival knowledge they'd learned from YouTube. Another kept asking if there was cell service anywhere nearby. One actually seemed to be enjoying the experience, which surprised me because he was usually the most high maintenance of our group. Daryl told us stories about the wildlife he'd encountered over the years. There was this one time a massive grizzly had wandered right up to his cabin and just stared at him through the window for 20 minutes. Another time he'd been surrounded by a pack of wolves, but they'd eventually moved on without incident. He said those were the most dangerous situations he'd faced in all his years on the job. The guy had clearly seen his share of wildlife encounters, but he handled everything with this calm professionalism that made you feel safe. You got the impression that if something did go wrong, Daryl would know exactly what to do. What I didn't know then was that other rangers had been telling stories for years about strange sounds in certain parts of the forest. Howls that didn't match any known animal, tracks that were too big and shaped wrong for bears, equipment that would go missing from remote stations with no explanation. But management always dismissed these reports, and most of the seasoned rangers like Daryl figured it was just new hires getting spooked by their own imaginations. Daryl later told me he had heard all the stories about creatures in the deep woods, but he'd always assumed they were just tales meant to scare newcomers. In 15 years of working that forest, the scariest thing he'd ever encountered was that bear staring him down. He was a practical guy who dealt in facts, not folklore. On our third day, we hiked deeper into the forest than we'd gone before. The terrain got rougher, more remote. We were probably 8 miles from the nearest road, in an area Daryl said most visitors never saw. That's when we came across the cave system. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, just a dark opening in a rocky hillside, maybe 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide. But there were warning signs posted all around it. Danger, unstable cave system, and authorized personnel only, and do not enter. The signs looked old, but well maintained. Daryl explained that the cave system extended deep into the hillside, with multiple chambers and passages. It had never been fully mapped, and there were concerns about structural integrity. A few years back, a geology team had gone in to do some surveys, but they'd recommended the caves be sealed off entirely. For now, the signs were considered sufficient deterrent. That should have been the end of it. Any reasonable person would have looked at those warning signs and moved on. But remember, we're talking about a group of guys who thought their money made them special, who'd paid extra for an exclusive experience, and who were probably looking for stories to impress people back home. Marcus was the first to suggest we take a look inside. Just a quick peek, he said. We weren't going to go deep or anything dangerous. Rodriguez immediately jumped on the idea, talking about how cool it would be to explore a cave that was off limits to regular tourists. Kyle started asking if Daryl had ever been inside. I could see Daryl getting uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. He was patient but firm. The caves were off limits for good reasons, and we needed to respect that. He suggested we continue our hike and see some of the scenic overlooks further up the trail, but these guys wouldn't let it go. Marcus pulled out his phone and started making calls, trying to reach his uncle, trying to find someone with enough authority to override Daryl's decision. Rodriguez was already taking selfies in front of the cave entrance. Denver was examining the warning signs like he was looking for loopholes. After about 30 minutes of this nonsense, Marcus's phone actually connected to someone with pull. I don't know exactly what was said, but I could hear Marcus explaining that we'd paid premium rates for a full access experience and that we just wanted to see inside the cave for a few minutes. Daryl's radio crackled to life maybe 10 minutes later. His supervisor's voice came through telling him to accommodate the clients within reasonable safety parameters. You could see Daryl's jaw clench as he acknowledged the order. He looked at us with this expression I'll never forget. Part frustration, part resignation, part something else I couldn't identify at the time. Later, I realized it might have been dread. Daryl made it clear that if we were going in, it would be on his terms. We'd stay together as a group. We wouldn't go more than a few hundred feet from the entrance. And if he said we were leaving immediately. No arguments, no negotiations. We agreed, of course. At that point, we were just excited to be getting our way. The cave was exactly what you'd expect. Cold, damp, and pitch black beyond the first few feet. We had flashlights, but the darkness seemed to swallow the light. The floor was uneven, with loose rocks and patches of mud. Water dripped constantly from somewhere overhead. Daryl led us about 50 feet in, far enough to satisfy our curiosity. The main passage split into 3 smaller tunnels, each disappearing into complete darkness. He explained that the cave system was much more extensive than it appeared from outside, with some passages extending hundreds of feet into the hillside. That should have been enough for any reasonable person. We'd seen the cave, taken our photos, satisfied our curiosity. But Rodriguez, being the kind of person he was, started pushing for us to explore one of the side passages. Just for a few minutes, he said. When would we ever get another chance to see something like this? Daryl was having none of it. He'd fulfilled his obligation by bringing us inside, and now it was time to go. But as we started heading back toward the entrance, Kyle noticed something in one of the side passages, what looked like carved symbols on the wall. I'm still not sure if there really were symbols or if Kyle was just seeing patterns in the rock formations. But it gave the group another excuse to push deeper. Marcus started backing up his brother, saying we'd come too far to leave without really exploring. Denver was taking photos of everything, treating it like some kind of archaeological discovery. The pressure kept building on Daryl, 5 guys all pushing him to bend the rules, all of us probably reminding him that we'd paid good money for this experience. I'm not proud of how we acted, but that's the truth of it. Finally, Daryl gave in. He agreed to let us explore one of the side passages for exactly 10 minutes, but only if we stayed in single file behind him and followed his instructions without question. The moment he said it was time to go, we went, no discussion. We followed him into the leftmost passage. The ceiling got lower and the walls narrower as we went deeper. Our flashlight beams created these dancing shadows that made everything look unstable and threatening. The sound of dripping water got louder, echoing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. Maybe 200 feet into the side passage, we reached a larger chamber. It was roughly circular, maybe 30 feet across, with several smaller passages branching off in different directions. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above our heads. That's when Rodriguez decided he needed the perfect Instagram photo. He wandered off toward one of the smaller passages, trying to get an artistic shot of his silhouette against the cave entrance. We could hear him moving around in the darkness, his footsteps echoing strangely. Then we heard him call out that he'd found something interesting. His voice sounded more distant than it should have, coming from somewhere deeper in the cave system. When we called back, asking him to return to the group, his responses got fainter and more confused. Daryl immediately took charge, ordering everyone to stay put while he went to retrieve Rodriguez. But after a few minutes, it became clear that Rodriguez had gotten himself lost in the maze of passages. We could hear him calling for help, but the echoes made it impossible to determine which direction his voice was coming from. That's when Daryl's whole demeanor changed. I'd seen him deal with various situations over the previous few days, and he'd always been calm and methodical. But suddenly he was tense, almost agitated. He kept shining his flashlight into the darker recesses of the chamber, like he was looking for something specific. He told us to stay absolutely quiet while he listened for Rodriguez. But as we stood there in silence, we started hearing other sounds. Not Rodriguez's voice, but something else. Movement in the darkness that didn't match human footsteps. A kind of shuffling or scraping noise that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Daryl's flashlight beam was moving more urgently now, sweeping back and forth across the chamber. He muttered something under his breath that I couldn't make out, but his tone made it clear he was worried about more than just Rodriguez being lost. He started moving toward the passage where we thought Rodriguez had gone, motioning for us to follow closely behind him. But as we entered the narrower tunnel, the strange noises got louder. It sounded like something large moving through the cave system, but not in the clumsy way a lost human would move. Daryl stopped suddenly and held up his hand for silence. In the quiet, we could hear Rodriguez calling for help from somewhere ahead, but there was panic in his voice now. He wasn't just lost, he was scared of something. That's when Daryl said the words that still give me chills. "We need to get out of here right now. There's something else in this cave system." I asked him what he meant, thinking maybe he was worried about structural collapse or dangerous wildlife. Bears sometimes use caves for hibernation, after all, but the look on his face told me it was something more than that. He started leading us back toward the main chamber, moving faster than before. He kept checking behind us with his flashlight, like he expected to see something following. The strange noises were getting more frequent now, and they seemed to be coming from all around us. As we reached the main chamber, we could hear Rodriguez's voice more clearly. He was definitely in trouble, calling for help and saying something about not being able to find his way out. But there was something else in his voice. Terror, like he wasn't just lost in the dark. Daryl made the decision to split our group. He told Marcus and Kyle to head back toward the cave entrance and wait for us there. If we weren't back in 20 minutes, they were to go get help. Denver and I would come with him to find Rodriguez. I remember thinking that was a smart plan. Get part of the group to safety, minimize the number of people who could get lost in the cave system. But as Marcus and Kyle disappeared back down the passage toward the entrance, I started feeling isolated and vulnerable. The three of us, me, Denver, and Daryl, moved deeper into the cave system, following Rodriguez's increasingly panicked calls for help. The passages got narrower and more confusing, branching off in directions that didn't seem to make logical sense. It felt like we were descending, though it was hard to tell for sure in the darkness. Maybe 15 minutes after we'd split up, we finally found Rodriguez. He was in a small chamber about the size of a closet, crouched against the far wall with his phone's flashlight dying. When our beams hit him, I could see the relief on his face, but also something else. He looked like he'd seen something that had shaken him badly. He started babbling about hearing movement in the caves, about feeling like something was watching him. He claimed he'd seen shapes moving just outside the range of his light, always staying in the darkest parts of the passages. Daryl and I exchanged glances. The guy was clearly spooked, but caves could play tricks on your mind. As we helped Rodriguez to his feet, Daryl started navigating us back toward the main chamber. But the cave system was more complex than any of us had realized. Passages that had seemed straightforward when we entered them now branched off in multiple directions. Every tunnel looked the same in our flashlight beams. After maybe 20 minutes of trying to retrace our steps, it became clear that we were lost. Daryl was still confident he could get us out, but it was going to take longer than expected. The passages all looked identical, and the echoing sounds made it impossible to get a sense of direction. That's when Denver stepped on loose rocks and went down hard, twisting his ankle badly. The scream he let out echoed through the cave system like a gunshot, bouncing off walls and amplifying until it sounded like a dozen people screaming at once. The echo hadn't even finished fading when we heard something else, a sound that definitely wasn't human, a low, rumbling noise that seemed to come from deep within the cave system. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, then stopped abruptly. Daryl froze, his flashlight beam steady on the passage ahead of us. He whispered for everyone to stay absolutely quiet and not move. Denver was trying to muffle his pain, but he was clearly in bad shape. Rodriguez was breathing heavily, still panicked from being lost. In the silence that followed, we heard movement. Not the random echoes and settling noises you'd expect in a cave, but purposeful movement. Something large was moving through the passages, and it seemed to be heading in our direction. Daryl helped Denver to his feet, supporting most of his weight. He whispered that we needed to move quickly and quietly toward the exit. No talking, no unnecessary noise. Just follow his lead and try to stay calm. But as we started moving through the passages, the sounds of pursuit got clearer. Heavy footsteps that didn't match any animal I was familiar with. The rhythm was wrong for a bear, too fast, too coordinated. And bears don't typically hunt in cave systems anyway. We moved as quickly as we could with Denver injured, but it wasn't fast enough. Whatever was in the caves with us was gaining ground. The sounds were getting closer, and now there were other noises too. What sounded like snuffling or heavy breathing, the scrape of something being dragged along the cave floor. Daryl was trying to navigate us out while supporting Denver's weight and keeping track of whatever was hunting us. I could see the strain on his face in the flashlight beam. This was beyond anything he'd prepared for. Rodriguez was starting to panic again, asking what was making those noises, whether it was bears or mountain lions. Daryl just kept telling us to stay quiet and keep moving. But I could tell from his expression that he didn't know what we were dealing with either. The passages seemed to go on forever. Every turn led to another branching tunnel. Every chamber opened onto more passages. We were deep in a cave system that was much more extensive than any of us had realized, and something was definitely tracking us through the darkness. Denver was getting weaker, the pain from his ankle making it harder for him to keep up. Rodriguez was hyperventilating, his flashlight beam shaking as his hands trembled. I was trying to stay calm, but the sounds behind us were getting closer and more aggressive. That's when we heard voices calling our names from somewhere ahead. Marcus and Kyle had either followed us into the cave system or had never made it to the entrance like Daryl had instructed. Their voices were echoing through the passages, making it hard to determine exactly where they were. Daryl made the decision to call back to them despite the risk of alerting whatever was hunting us. We needed to regroup and get everyone moving toward the exit together. But as soon as we started calling out, the sounds behind us got more urgent. Whatever was back there was responding to our voices. We finally connected with Marcus and Kyle in what I think was the same main chamber where we had started our search for Rodriguez. They looked relieved to see us, but also confused about why we were moving so urgently. Daryl quickly explained that there was dangerous wildlife in the cave system and we needed to get out immediately. As a group of 5, we started moving toward what Daryl believed was the passage back to the entrance. Denver was struggling with his ankle, supported by Kyle on one side. Rodriguez was still panicked but functional. Marcus was asking questions about what kind of wildlife we were talking about. That's when we realized the sounds weren't just behind us anymore. They were coming from multiple directions, like whatever was in the caves had split up to surround us, or like there was more than one of them. The passage back to the entrance seemed longer than it had when we'd entered the cave. In our panic and disorientation, we might have taken a wrong turn somewhere. The darkness beyond our flashlight beams felt oppressive, like it was closing in on us. Rodriguez was the first to see it. He was bringing up the rear of our group when he stopped suddenly and pointed his flashlight back down the passage we'd just come from. In the beam of light, maybe 50 feet behind us, there was a shape that definitely wasn't human. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall and covered in dark fur. It moved with a fluid, coordinated motion that was nothing like any bear I'd ever seen. The proportions were all wrong for any animal I was familiar with. The arms were too long, the shoulders too broad, and it was bipedal, moving upright like a person, but with a gait that was unmistakably inhuman. We all saw it at the same time. Marcus cursed, Denver nearly collapsed, Kyle grabbed his brother's arm. But Daryl went into full professional mode. He pulled out a service weapon, a .40 caliber pistol, and positioned himself between our group and the thing in the passage. He told us to keep moving toward the exit while he covered our retreat. No arguments, no hesitation, just get out of the cave system as quickly as possible. He'd catch up with us once he'd dealt with the situation, but the thing in the passage wasn't alone. As we started moving again, we could see other shapes moving in the darkness around us. The cave system was more populated than we'd realized, and we'd stumbled into their territory. Daryl was shouting for us to move faster, to get to the entrance. Denver was doing his best with his injured ankle, supported by the other guys. I was helping Rodriguez, who was barely functional with panic. And behind us, Daryl was facing down something that shouldn't have existed, In all the chaos, Rodriguez did something incredibly stupid. Instead of focusing on getting out of the cave, he pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. The camera flash lit up the cave passage like lightning, revealing details that our flashlights had missed. There were at least 3 of them that I could see. Massive, fur-covered bipedal creatures that moved with intelligence and coordination. They weren't random animals that had wandered into the cave. This was their territory, and we were the intruders. Rodriguez managed to take one clear photo before Daryl saw what he was doing and yelled at him to put the phone away and run. But that single image captured everything. The creatures closing in on us. Daryl with his gun drawn, standing between us and them like some kind of guardian angel. The sounds that followed will haunt me for the rest of my life. Gunshots echoing through the cave system, snarling and roaring that didn't sound like any earthly animal, and Daryl shouting for us to keep running. Then more gunshots, closer together, like he was firing as fast as he could pull the trigger. We reached what we thought was the passage to the entrance and kept moving. Behind us, the sounds got worse. Impacts like bodies hitting stone walls, more of that inhuman roaring. And Daryl's voice getting more desperate. He was still shooting, but the sounds were getting closer to him. The last thing I heard clearly was Daryl screaming something I couldn't make out, followed by 3 more gunshots in rapid succession. Then there was a sound like something heavy hitting the ground, and everything went quiet except for our own panicked breathing and footsteps. We didn't look back. We didn't stop to help. We ran through that cave system like our lives depended on it, which they probably did. Denver was barely conscious from pain and shock, but we kept him moving. Rodriguez was in complete panic mode, but functional enough to follow directions. Finding the actual exit took another 20 minutes of navigating passages in near complete panic. We were operating on pure adrenaline and desperation. Every shadow looked like one of these creatures, every sound made us jump. When we finally saw natural light filtering in from the cave entrance, it felt like a miracle. We stumbled out into the December afternoon, gasping and shaking. The normal forest sounds, wind in the trees, distant bird calls, seemed impossibly peaceful after what we'd experienced in the cave. We made it back to Daryl's ranger station in record time, basically carrying Denver between us. Kyle called 911 while Marcus tried to reach someone in the Forest Service. Rodriguez was still in shock, staring at the photo on his phone like he couldn't believe what he'd captured. The emergency response was immediate and overwhelming. Search and rescue teams, Forest Service personnel, law enforcement, even what looked like federal agents. They took our statements separately, asking detailed questions about what had happened in the cave and what we'd seen. I told them everything exactly as it had occurred, but I could tell from their expressions that they weren't buying the part about the creatures. They seemed focused on the idea that Daryl had been attacked by bears or mountain lions while trying to help us navigate the cave system. Rodriguez showed them the photo on his phone, that single clear image he'd captured in the chaos. But within an hour of showing it to the authorities, his phone was confiscated as evidence. They told him he'd get it back after their investigation was complete, but something about their tone suggested otherwise. Over the next few hours, it became clear that our story wasn't going to be part of any official record. Federal agents pulled us aside individually and explained that our presence in the cave system had been unauthorized and potentially illegal. The Forest Service had specific protocols for VIP access, and those protocols hadn't been followed. They offered us a deal. In exchange for keeping quiet about the details of what had happened in the cave, all potential charges related to trespassing and endangering a federal employee would be dropped. Our names wouldn't appear in any reports, and the incident would be classified as a routine bear attack during a standard ranger patrol. Rodriguez tried to argue about his phone and the photo he'd taken, but they made it clear that the device was now evidence in a federal investigation. If he wanted to avoid serious legal consequences, he'd forget about any photos and focus on getting back to his normal life. The official story, when it was released to local media 3 days later, was straightforward. Ranger Daryl had been killed in a bear attack while conducting a routine patrol of remote cave systems. He was being remembered as a dedicated public servant who died in the line of duty protecting the wilderness he loved. There was no mention of VIP visitors, no reference to unauthorized cave exploration, no discussion of anything unusual about the circumstances of his death. Just a tragic but routine wildlife encounter that had cost a good man his life. I tried calling the Forest Service a few weeks later, asking about memorial services for Daryl or ways to honor his sacrifice. The person I spoke with was polite but clear. There had been a private service for family and colleagues, and they weren't looking for additional participation from outside parties. It's been over 4 years since that day in the cave, and I still wake up some nights hearing those sounds, the gunshots echoing through stone passages, the inhuman roaring, and Daryl's voice getting more desperate as he bought us the time we needed to escape. Marcus and Kyle don't talk about what happened anymore. They went back to their normal lives, their normal problems, like it was all just a bad dream. Denver recovered from his ankle injury, but he's never been the same. He avoids outdoor activities now, sticks to city environments where everything makes sense. Rodriguez moved to a different state about 6 months after the incident. Last I heard, he was working for a different investment firm and had sworn off any kind of wilderness recreation. The experience broke something in him that never quite healed. I've spent a lot of time researching cave systems in that part of Montana, trying to understand what we encountered. There are stories going back generations about strange things in the deep woods, unexplained disappearances, sounds that don't match any known wildlife. But they're all just stories, folklore, local legends that nobody takes seriously. The official records show that Ranger Daryl died in a bear attack on December 15, 2019, while conducting routine cave system maintenance. There's no mention of the massive bipedal creatures that hunted us through those passages, no reference to his heroic last stand, no acknowledgement of how he sacrificed his life to save 5 idiots who never should have been there in the first place. But I know the truth. And I have to live with the fact that a good man died because of our selfishness and stupidity. Daryl had 15 years of experience dealing with legitimate wilderness dangers: bears, mountain lions, wolves. The most dangerous thing he'd ever faced was a grizzly staring him down through his cabin window. But what we found in those caves was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist but does. Living in the deepest parts of cave systems where humans never go. Something that's intelligent enough to hunt cooperatively and territorial enough to defend its home against intruders. I've kept quiet about the details for 4 years, honoring the agreement we made with federal authorities. But Daryl deserves better than the official story. He deserves to be remembered for what he actually did, standing between 5 helpless civilians and creatures that would have killed us all without hesitation. Rodriguez managed to send that photo to his personal email before they confiscated his phone. He shared it with me about a year after the incident, saying he needed someone else to confirm he wasn't losing his mind. The image quality isn't perfect. It was taken in panic with a phone camera in near complete darkness, but it shows everything. You can see Daryl in the foreground, his service weapon drawn, facing something that's definitely not a bear or mountain lion. The creature closest to him is massive, covered in dark fur, standing upright like a person, but with proportions that are clearly not human. In the background, you can make out at least 2 more shapes moving in the shadows. It's the clearest photograph of these creatures that I've ever seen, and it proves that what we experienced in those caves was real. But it's also evidence of a man's final moments, his last stand against something that shouldn't exist but does. I look at that photo sometimes when I'm having trouble sleeping, when the official story about bear attacks starts to feel more real than my own memories. It reminds me that Ranger Daryl was a hero who died protecting people he barely knew, facing down creatures that most people would dismiss as fantasy. So that's what really happened in those caves in Montana. Not a routine bear attack, not a tragic accident during standard patrol operations. A group of entitled city guys pushed a good man into a situation he never should have been in. And when something unimaginable came out of the darkness to hunt us, he stood his ground and bought us the time we needed to escape. Daryl had been hearing stories about strange things in the deep woods for 15 years, but he'd never believed them. To him, they were just tales meant to scare newcomers, folklore that had no place in practical forest management. The most dangerous thing he'd ever encountered was normal wildlife, bears and wolves that followed predictable patterns and could be managed with standard protocols. But in those caves, he came face to face with something that didn't fit any category in his training manuals. Something that was intelligent, coordinated, and territorial in ways that no known wildlife species could match. And when it came time to choose between his own safety and the lives of the people he'd been assigned to protect, he didn't hesitate. The official records will always show that he died in a bear attack. The federal authorities made sure of that, prioritizing secrecy over truth, bureaucracy over honor. But the people who were there that day know what really happened. And we owe it to Daryl's memory to make sure his sacrifice isn't forgotten, even if it can never be officially acknowledged. I don't know if those creatures are still in that cave system. The entrance was sealed with concrete barriers about 6 months after the incident, officially for geological safety concerns. But sometimes I wonder if there are other cave systems, other places where things that shouldn't exist have found ways to survive in the modern world. What I do know is that Ranger Daryl was a better man than any of us deserve, and he died protecting people who had no business being where we were. He spent his last moments facing down the impossible, giving everything he had to make sure we made it out alive. That's the real story. That's what actually happened in those caves, and that's why I'll never forget the sound of his voice echoing through stone passages, shouting for us to keep running while he stood alone against the darkness. For more interesting stories like this, consider checking out this one.